They say the Celts left behind no great temples of stone, no sprawling empires carved into maps of the ancient world. And yet, what they gave us may be even more enduring, stories of spirits and hidden realms that still whisper across Europe. Unlike the familiar gods of Greece or Egypt, the Celtic myths dwell in twilight places, in the rustle of sacred groves, the mist rising from riverbanks, and the silence of burial mounds that open into other worlds. According to legend, the Celts believed the boundary between life and death was never fixed. A traveler could stumble across it without warning. A mound on the hillside might reveal a doorway. A lake could conceal an entire kingdom below its surface. The veil between realms was thin, and in that fragile space dwelt the Sídhe, powerful beings often reduced in later tales to fairies, but in truth closer to gods, ancestors, and spirits of the land itself. Who were these people that carried such a worldview? The Celts were not a single nation, but a loose confederation of tribes spread across Iron Age Europe. Their world stretched from the forests of Gaul to the windswept coasts of Ireland, from the highlands of Scotland to the plains of Central Europe. To the Romans, they were fierce warriors and elusive enemies. But within their own traditions, they saw themselves as part of a living cosmos, where every tree, river, and hill carried a presence, and every ritual was a dialogue with the unseen. At the heart of this vision stood the Druids. Much about them remains cloaked in mystery, for they left no written texts of their own. Roman writers described them as priests, philosophers, and judges, but also as guardians of dangerous knowledge. What seems certain is that the Druids held the keys to memory. They preserved myths and lineages, guided rituals, and maintained the fragile balance between the tribe and the otherworld. To the Celts, wisdom was not only in words, but in silence, in the rhythm of chants, in the sacred oak groves, where Druids performed rites far from the eyes of outsiders. And there was more. Alongside the Druids and the Sídhe, stories speak of figures like Bran the Blessed, a giant king who straddled the line between history and myth. Legends tell that when he was mortally wounded, he ordered his head to be severed and buried beneath the White Hill in London, where it would guard the land from invasion. Even today, some say that the Tower of London stands where Bran's head once lay, and that Britain's fate is tied to this unseen relic. These myths often point to a pattern. The Celtic imagination was less concerned with immortalizing perfect gods in the sky, and more with describing thresholds between life and death, this world and the next, tribe and stranger. Sacred trees connected heaven and earth. Burial mounds connected the living to their ancestors, and rivers carried prayers to the unseen. To enter a forest at dusk was to step closer to the otherworld, and to eat food offered by a spirit was to risk never returning. It is this sense of porous borders, of a universe alive with crossings and passages, that makes the Celtic myths so haunting. Unlike the fixed pantheons of Greece or Egypt, here we encounter a landscape itself turned sacred. The stories invite us to listen not just for heroes and battles, but for the whisper of leaves, the hum of ritual, the quiet steps that lead into another realm. And perhaps that is why these legends endure. They are not only tales of long-vanished tribes, but echoes of how humans once experienced the world, not as separate from nature, but woven into it. Each myth, each spirit, each Druid's chant was a reminder that reality has more than one face, and that just beyond the horizon of sight lies a world as vast as imagination itself. To understand the myths of the Celts, one must first walk the land they once called home. Unlike the empires of the Mediterranean, whose capitals shone with marble, the Celtic world was diffuse, stretching like a patchwork across Europe. From the Iberian Peninsula to the Danube Basin, from Gaul to the green fields of Ireland, their presence left a network of languages, artifacts, and sacred sites. The landscape itself shaped the stories they carried. In Gaul, the region that corresponds to modern-day France and parts of Belgium and Switzerland, the Celts lived amid dense forests and powerful rivers. Julius Caesar, though an enemy, remarked on their courage and the role of Druids in their society. Yet, for all Rome's commentary, the Gauls kept their deeper rituals hidden. Sacred groves dotted the land, where ceremonies bound tribe and cosmos together. The oak tree, in particular, was a living symbol. Its roots reached into the earth, its trunk anchored the human world, and its crown touched the heavens. Further west, in the mist-laden isles of Britain and Ireland, the Celtic imagination seemed to expand even more vividly. Here the natural environment played an intimate role in myth-making. Hills became doorways to the otherworld, rivers housed goddesses of fertility, and standing stones aligned with the movements of the sun and moon. Archaeologists still uncover evidence that ancient people here marked solstices and equinoxes with precision, suggesting a worldview that was not only mystical but also profoundly astronomical. The Celts did not carve their myths into stone tablets like the Sumerians, nor did they write epic poems like the Greeks. Their tradition was oral, passed from druid to apprentice, from elder to child. This choice, deliberate or not, allowed the stories to flow like rivers, changing shape with each retelling. It also made them vulnerable. What we know today comes filtered through Christian monks who later recorded Irish and Welsh legends, often reshaping them in the process. Yet within those manuscripts, the Book of Invasions, the Mabinogion, echoes of the older, wilder myths still linger. The age of these myths is difficult to measure, for they shift and blur across centuries. Some scholars argue that fragments may stretch back to the Bronze Age, when Indo-European tribes first spread through Europe. Others note parallels between Celtic deities and those of India, suggesting a distant shared ancestry or belief. What is clear is that by the Iron Age, when the Celts were at their height, their mythological system was fully alive, complex, varied, and deeply tied to the cycles of nature. The tribes themselves were not a single political unit, but rather a constellation of peoples. The Helvetii of modern Switzerland, the Boii of Central Europe, the Gaels and Britons of the Isles. Each group carried local variations of shared mythic themes. One region might emphasize a war goddess, another a hero king, while all recognized the sacredness of water, earth, and sky. Unlike the centralized pantheons of Greece, Celtic gods could appear in many guises, under many names, yet still belong to a larger spiritual family. This fluidity is reflected in the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, one of the most mysterious groups in Celtic legend. Described as divine beings who arrived in Ireland in a cloud of mist, they possessed magical skills and knowledge beyond human reach. Some say they came from across the sea, others that they rose out of the earth itself. After battles and shifting fortunes, they were said to retreat into the hills and mounds, becoming the Sídhe. Thus the gods themselves became the hidden spirits of the landscape, watching over humankind from the other side of the veil. Geography, memory, and belief intertwined here in ways difficult for outsiders to untangle. Where the Greeks saw Olympus as the seat of the divine, and the Egyptians saw the Nile as a god's gift, the Celts perceived divinity everywhere. A spring in Gaul dedicated to a healing goddess might echo the role of a lake in Ireland where offerings were cast for blessing. Even in distant parts of their world, a traveler could sense the same mythic logic. The land was alive, the otherworld was near, and every human step carried echoes of the sacred. This was the world in which their myths grew, not the world of empires, but of tribes and landscapes. Not marble columns, but circles of stone. Not libraries of parchment, but memory guarded by Druids. A fragile world, but also one that could survive in whispers, pass through generations, until at last it was written down. And it is in that delicate survival that we glimpse the resilience of their stories, which still resonate even after centuries of conquest and change. When we search for the origins of Celtic myth, we encounter a paradox. The people who created these stories lived in a culture rich with ritual and oral poetry, yet they left almost nothing in writing. The earliest versions we know do not come from the mouths of Druids or bards, but from those who observed them from outside, Roman generals, Greek travelers, and much later, Christian monks. And so, the oldest fragments of these myths lie half-hidden, caught between admiration, fear, and reinterpretation. According to ancient writers, Druids spent up to 20 years in training, mastering complex verses and genealogies that were never to be written down. This prohibition was both practical and spiritual. Words, when carved on stone or parchment, could be corrupted, misused, or stripped of their sacred rhythm. Spoken aloud, in contrast, they lived and breathed, carrying power with each repetition. The result was a living library stored in memory, vulnerable to conquest, yet resilient across centuries. One of the earliest outside witnesses was the Greek historian Posidonius in the 1st century BC. He described the Celts as fierce warriors, but he also hinted at their fascination with the cosmos. Later, Julius Caesar himself wrote that the Druids taught doctrines of a soul's immortality, that death was not an end but a passage into another life. This belief, recorded by Rome's greatest general, may explain the haunting quality of Celtic myth. It assumes a cycle where nothing is final, and every ending is also a threshold. But the deepest origins are even harder to trace. Archaeological finds across Europe, bronze cauldrons, ritual masks, carved figures, suggest a continuity of belief stretching back long before the Iron Age. In Denmark, the Gundestrup cauldron, dated to the 2nd century BCE, shows gods with antlers, warriors, and animals in symbolic scenes that resonate with Irish myths written down more than 1,000 years later. Such artifacts hint that the stories of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the Sídhe, and the Druids were rooted in a much older, pan-European spiritual fabric. When Christianity spread into Ireland and Britain, monks began recording the oral traditions, partly to preserve them, partly to reshape them. In the Liber Gabala Iren, the Book of Invasions compiled around the 11th century, we find a grand myth of Ireland's settlement. It tells how wave after wave of peoples arrived, culminating with the Tuatha Dé Danann, who battled the Firbolg and the Fomorians before retreating into the mounds. This narrative bears traces of oral cycles much older, rearranged into a Christianized chronology of peoples of the past. Welsh traditions, preserved in the Mabinogion, carry a different flavor. These tales, copied into manuscripts in the 12th and 13th centuries, present a world of enchanted cauldrons, giants, and shape-shifting beings. They are not histories in the strict sense, but mythic dramas. Yet beneath the Christian gloss, we can sense echoes of older beliefs. The cauldron of rebirth, the magical horse that crosses worlds, the goddess who rules sovereignty of the land. The transformation of oral myth into written manuscript was never neutral. Priests and monks filtered stories through their own worldview. Gods might be recast as kings, spirits as demons, rituals as superstition. And yet, in their effort to preserve and control, they inadvertently allowed fragments of the old worldview to survive. Without them, the voices of Druids and bards might have vanished entirely. The result is that Celtic myth reaches us as a palimpsest, a manuscript written over many times. Behind the Christian saints stand shadows of gods. Behind the legends of kings stand echoes of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Even words themselves carry traces. Names of rivers, hills, and towns across Europe still recall ancient deities whose stories are now forgotten. Perhaps that is why the myths feel both familiar and elusive. They belong to a world we can almost glimpse, but never fully recover. They have drifted like mist across centuries, reshaped by conquerors, scribes, and storytellers. What remains are not ruins of temples, but living fragments, words, images, and rhythms that still carry power when spoken aloud. And so, the origins of Celtic myth are less a fixed point in history than a river of voices, flowing from prehistory into the present. Each retelling changes the current, but the water remains the same, a sense that beyond the veil lies a world alive, waiting to be remembered. Among the many threads woven into the Celtic tapestry, the figures that stand out most clearly are not always gods in the Greek sense, nor saints in the Christian one. They are something in between, beings who blur the line between mortal and divine, human and otherworldly. To explore them is to step into a gallery of archetypes, Druids who carry forbidden wisdom, heroes whose strength is shadowed by fate, and the Sídhe themselves, who linger as both ancestors and deities. The Druids remain the most enigmatic. Roman accounts describe them as priests and lawmakers, the ones who stood apart from the rest of the tribe. But in Celtic tradition, they were more than religious officials. They were keepers of memory. They recited genealogies, settled disputes, read omens, and oversaw rituals in sacred groves. Unlike Greek philosophers, whose writings filled scrolls, Druids embodied their wisdom in performance, a chant, a judgment, a sacrifice. Caesar wrote that they taught the doctrine of rebirth, the belief that the soul never perished but passed into another body. Whether this was literal or metaphorical, It reflected a worldview where continuity mattered more than endings. The Sídhe, often mistranslated as fairies, were nothing like the winged figures of later folklore. According to legend, they were once the Tuatha Dé Danann, divine beings of immense power who, after defeat, retreated into the hollow hills. There they became the hidden folk of the mounds, emerging only at liminal times of year, such as Samhain, when the veil between worlds was thin. They were not merely mischievous sprites, but rulers of entire otherworldly realms. Some were benevolent, granting blessings and fertility. Others were perilous, luring mortals into feasts from which they might never return. To the Celts, the Sídhe were not fantasy, but neighbors in a parallel world, close enough to influence crops, weather, and fate itself. Alongside these beings stood the heroes, many of whom straddled myth and history. Bran the Blessed, the giant king of Britain, embodied sovereignty itself. His immense size symbolized protection, and his head, when buried beneath the White Hill, was said to guard the island forever. In Ireland, the warrior Luff shone as a figure of brilliance, skilled in all arts, master of every craft, the long-armed, one whose spear was unstoppable. He was no narrow specialist, but a universal hero, embodying the Celtic admiration for versatility and adaptability. Then there's Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, whose story rivals that of Achilles in its intensity. Gifted with superhuman battle rage, he defended Ulster against overwhelming odds, yet his life was marked by tragedy, bound by Gisa, sacred taboos that, once broken, sealed his doom. Like many Celtic heroes, he was at once invincible and vulnerable, a living contradiction. His story reflects a recurring theme, that greatness is inseparable from sacrifice, and that no hero escapes the shadow of fate. The goddesses of the Celtic pantheon also hold striking power. The Morrígan, often seen as a triple goddess, appeared as maiden, mother, and crone, embodying war, fate, and sovereignty. She could grant victory, or she could foretell death. Sometimes she appeared as a raven circling the battlefield, a reminder that death was not an accident but part of the woven order. Meanwhile, Brigid, goddess of poetry, healing, and smithcraft, embodied life's sustaining arts. Her presence shows that Celtic myth did not glorify only war, but also the quiet forces that held communities together. Comparisons with other cultures reveal familiar patterns, yet with a Celtic twist. Like the Greek Hermes, Luff was a god of many skills. Like the Norse Odin, the Druids sought hidden knowledge and sacrificed comfort for wisdom. Like the Egyptian Isis, Brigid embodied nurturing and healing. But unlike these more centralized pantheons, the Celtic versions were never fixed. They shifted, multiplied, and adapted, taking on local flavors. This fluidity is part of their enduring fascination. The Celts were less concerned with rigid order and more with reflecting life's unpredictability. Even animals served as archetypes. The stag symbolized the wild, untamed power of the forest. The salmon represented wisdom, its flesh said to contain knowledge of the world. Horses, often linked to goddesses, embodied sovereignty and the bond between ruler and land. To see these creatures was to glimpse not just nature, but signs from the otherworld. Taken together, these figures form a worldview less about hierarchy and more about cycles. The Druids preserved wisdom, the Sídhe embodied the land's mysteries, the heroes enacted the struggles of fate, and the goddesses balanced war with fertility, destruction with healing. It was a mythology of balance, of crossing thresholds, and of remembering that life was never linear, but circular, a cycle of death and rebirth, concealment and revelation. Among the many stories carried through Celtic memory, few are as striking as the first battle of Mag Tuired, a tale where gods, mortals, and spirits clash in a drama that feels both mythic and eerily human. This story unfolds like a miniature epic, complete with betrayal, courage, and a turning point that reshaped the fate of Ireland's otherworldly beings. According to legend, the Tuatha Dé Danann arrived in Ireland in a shroud of mist, their ships hidden as if the land itself summoned them. They were a people of magic and wisdom, descended from the goddess Danu, carrying treasures of immense power, the spear of Luff, the sword of Nuada, the stone of Fal, and the cauldron of the Dagda. Each artifact embodied sovereignty, judgment, or abundance, representing the balance they brought with them. Yet their arrival set them on a collision course with the Fir Bolg, the people already inhabiting the land. The Tuatha Dé Danann sought not to destroy, but to rule alongside destiny itself. Negotiations gave way to conflict, and so began the Battle of Mag Tuired. At first it was a clash of equals. Warriors fought in shining armor, druids chanted spells, and champions from both sides tested their strength. Nuada, the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, led his people with courage, but in the heat of battle he lost his arm. In Celtic tradition, a blemished king could not rule, for the king embodied the land itself, and the land demanded wholeness. Though Nuada survived, his wound shifted the balance of power. Here enters a darker figure, Bress, who was chosen as king in Nuada's place. Handsome but cruel, Bress favored oppression over generosity, taxing his people, neglecting hospitality, a grave violation in Celtic culture, where feasts and gift-giving bound communities together. His rule showed that kingship was not only about might, but about honoring sacred customs. Under Bress, the Tuatha Dé Danann suffered, and murmurs of rebellion began to stir. The story twists again when Nuada's arm is replaced with one of silver, forged by the physician Gen Sect and his son. With this restoration, he regained his kingship, reminding listeners that healing and craft could restore balance where brute strength had failed. Yet Bress would not yield easily, and soon he sought allies among the Fomorians, a race of giants and sea raiders who embodied chaos and destruction. The stage was set for a greater struggle, one that would define not just rulers, but the very order of the world. The first battle of Mag Tuired ends with the Tuatha Dé Danann victorious, though scarred. Nuada regained his throne, but the shadow of the Fomorians loomed, and the betrayal of Bress foreshadowed further turmoil. The story carries themes that ripple through Celtic myth: the cost of kingship, the link between body and land, the fragility of power when it forgets generosity. It is a drama not of distant gods, but of beings who live by laws that feel strikingly human. To an ancient audience, this tale was more than entertainment. It explained why a king must be whole in body and spirit. It warned against rulers who broke the sacred bond of hospitality, and it reassured listeners that balance could be restored, not only through war, but through craft, healing, and resilience. For us today, the story still resonates. It suggests that leadership is less about force and more about honoring bonds between people, land, and the unseen. The silver arm of Nuada remains a symbol of renewal, that even when wounded, one can be restored, and that brokenness need not end in defeat. If the first battle of Mag Tuired taught lessons of kingship and restoration, the second battle of Mag Tuired expanded the stage into a full mythic epic, one that carried alternative tellings and regional variations, showing how Celtic tradition thrived not on a single canon, but on a chorus of voices. Here the Tuatha Dé Danann faced the Fomorians, a race portrayed as sea raiders, giants, or embodiments of chaos, depending on the storyteller. In every version, the struggle was not merely physical, but cosmic, a clash between order and disorder, generosity and tyranny. According to one account, the Tuatha Dé Danann had lived under Bress's cruel reign after Nuada's wounding. But when Nuada was restored with a silver arm, Bress fled to his mother's people, the Fomorians, and returned with their armies. Under his command was the formidable Balor of the Evil Eye, a giant whose single gaze could wither armies. Legends describe his eye as so powerful it required 4 men to lift its lid. Wherever Balor looked, death followed. Against this force rose Luff, the Bright One, grandson of Balor himself, though raised among the Tuatha Dé Danann. Luff was no ordinary warrior. He was a master of every art, able to outmatch any champion in skill. In some tellings, when he first arrived at Nuada's court, he was asked what craft he brought: smithing, healing, poetry, warfare. Each time, the court replied they already had someone skilled in that art. Only when he declared he mastered all crafts was he welcomed, for he embodied the ideal of wholeness. The battle that followed is told in different voices. In one version, the Tuatha Dé Danann fought with desperate courage, aided by druidic spells and enchanted weapons. Balor's eye struck down warriors by the dozens. Yet when he turned it upon Luff, the young hero hurled a spear that pierced the giant's head, forcing the deadly eye to fall backward and destroy Balor's own army. In another version, Luff uses a slingshot, echoing the story of David and Goliath from biblical tradition, suggesting later Christian influence. Whatever the weapon, the outcome is the same. Luff, grandson of the monster, becomes the slayer of his kin, fulfilling a prophecy that Balor would fall by his own bloodline. The second battle of Mag Tuired ends with the Tuatha Dé Danann victorious. Nuada, however, falls in battle, and Luff takes his place as king, embodying renewal and the dawn of a golden age. In some retellings, Bress is captured alive and bargains for his life by teaching agriculture, how to plow, sow, and reap at the right times. Thus, even a traitor becomes a vessel of knowledge, and the story affirms that wisdom can emerge even from defeat. What makes these myths especially rich is their plurality. In some regions, Luff is the central hero. In others, the Dagda, the good god known for his cauldron of abundance, plays the greater role, using trickery and might to undermine the Fomorians. Still other stories emphasize the Morrígan, who appears before the battle as a raven, promising victory but also reminding mortals of death's inevitability. The Celtic imagination did not require one definitive version. To retell a myth was to weave it anew, adjusting its rhythm to the tribe, the season, the audience. This flexibility explains why the myths endure. They were not bound to a single scripture or priesthood. They belonged to the people, who reshaped them with every retelling. To sit by a fire in Connacht in Wales or in Gaul was to hear echoes of the same cosmic struggle, yet in a voice fitted to that land and that moment. Each story carried the core, that life is a contest between chaos and balance, destruction and renewal, and that heroes rise not to end the cycle, but to keep it turning. In these variations, we glimpse the genius of Celtic storytelling. Where later traditions often sought a final word, the Celts allowed for multiplicity, for contradictions, for parallel truths. And perhaps that is why, even centuries later, their myths feel alive. They are not monuments frozen in stone, but rivers still flowing, ready to be told again in a new form, beyond battles and kings. What gives Celtic myth its distinctive depth is its tapestry of symbols. These were not abstract emblems, but living presences, drawn from the land itself. Animals, numbers, and trees carried messages from the unseen. Each was a vessel of meaning, a reminder that the ordinary world was always intertwined with the otherworld. Among animals, none were more revered than the stag. To encounter a stag in a story is often to stand at the threshold of a revelation. Its antlers, branching like trees, were a symbol of renewal, shedding and regrowing with the seasons. In many tales, a white stag leads hunters or heroes into the otherworld, vanishing into mist just as the boundary between realms dissolves. The stag was not prey to be taken lightly, but a guide, sometimes a disguise of the gods themselves. The salmon held another kind of power. In Irish legend, the salmon of knowledge swam in the well of wisdom, eating the hazelnuts that fell from the sacred trees above. Whoever ate the salmon would gain all knowledge. The young hero Finn Mac Cumhaill, destined to become Ireland's greatest warrior, accidentally tasted its flesh while cooking it for his master, and thus inherited wisdom. Here, the humble fish became a cosmic symbol. Knowledge was not a gift from the heavens, but something hidden in nature, waiting to be discovered. Birds, too, carried potent meanings. Ravens and crows were linked to the Morrígan, their circling flight on battlefields a sign of death's approach. Swans often appeared as messengers of transformation, shifting between human and animal forms. In many tales, they symbolized love, loss, and the soul's journey across realms. Horses, associated with goddesses like Epona and Rhiannon, embodied sovereignty and the intimate bond between ruler and land. To dishonor a horse was to disrupt the balance of kingship itself. Numbers carried sacred resonance as well. The Celts favored triads, groups of three, as expressions of balance and completeness. The Morrígan herself was often depicted as three sisters in one, embodying maiden, mother, and crone. Triads appear in proverbs, laws, and mythic motifs. 3 quests, 3 blows, 3 days. The number 3 was not mathematical but symbolic, a way of expressing the unity of past, present, and future, or the cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. Yet it was trees that held the deepest sacred role. The oak, ash, and yew were considered pillars between worlds. To cut down a sacred tree was an act of spiritual violence. Each tribe often had its own bile, a great tree standing at the center of community life, under whose branches treaties were made and rituals performed. The oak symbolized strength and endurance, the yew death and immortality, the ash cosmic balance. The Druids, whose very name may derive from Deru, oak, performed ceremonies in oak groves, affirming the tree's place as the axis of the Celtic cosmos. Wells and rivers, too, became more than sources of water. They were entrances to the Otherworld, places where offerings were cast. Countless swords, cauldrons, and ornaments have been discovered in bogs and lakes, gifts left for deities who dwelled beneath the surface. The River Boyne in Ireland, linked to the goddess Bone, and the River Severn in Britain, associated with Sabrina, remind us that water itself was a living spirit, feminine, fertile, and often dangerous. These symbols wove daily life into myth. To eat bread beside a sacred well was not just nourishment, but a prayer. To mark a tree with offerings was to honor ancestors and gods alike. To see a raven at dawn could change the course of the day. The Celts lived in a landscape charged with signs, each one speaking to them in a language of presence. For modern ears, such symbols may feel distant, yet they resonate because they remind us of something we have not forgotten, that the natural world has meanings beyond utility, that the flight of a bird or the whisper of a tree might carry truths about ourselves. The Celts encoded those truths in their myths, ensuring that every story, however fantastical, was also a mirror of the living world. Though centuries of conquest and conversion reshaped Europe, the echoes of Celtic myth never truly vanished. They survived by adapting, slipping into local customs, disguising themselves in festivals, resurfacing in literature, and in recent times, flourishing again through popular culture. To trace these echoes is to see how ancient stories still breathe in the rhythms of daily life. Consider the calendar. The Celts marked time with festivals that honored thresholds between seasons and worlds. Samhain, celebrated at the end of October, marked the transition from light to darkness, harvest to winter. It was believed that on this night the veil between worlds grew thin, allowing the dead to walk among the living. Centuries later, the Church placed All Saints' Day in early November, reshaping but never fully erasing the older ritual. Today, Samhain's memory lives on most clearly in Halloween, where costumes, candles, and spirits still echo that ancient night of crossings. Beltane, the festival of fire in early May, celebrated fertility and renewal. Bonfires were lit on hillsides, and cattle were driven between them for protection and blessing. Couples leaped through the flames as symbols of union and vitality. Though the ritual waned under Christianity, traces linger in May Day traditions, where dancing around the maypole and crowning the May Queen carry faint but recognizable echoes of Beltane's joy. Language, too, preserves myth. Place names across Ireland, Wales, and Scotland still recall figures of legend. Dublin's River Liffey was once linked to a goddess, while Loch Nee was said to have sprung from the footprint of a giant. Even London's White Hill, associated with Bran the Blessed, ties geography to myth. Everyday words also carry remnants. In Irish, the word Sídhe still means mound, but in folklore it signals the presence of the otherworld. In medieval literature, Celtic motifs blended with Arthurian romance. The Grail, often imagined as a Christian relic, has deep parallels with the cauldrons of Celtic myth, vessels of abundance, rebirth, and knowledge. Knights who ventured into enchanted forests to test their valor walked paths already mapped by Celtic heroes chasing stags or swans into the otherworld. The legends of Merlin echo the role of Druids as keepers of arcane wisdom, while Morgan Le Fay preserves something of the Morrigan's shifting, ambivalent power. In modern times, Celtic myth has inspired poets, novelists, and musicians. W.B. Yeats drew on Irish folklore to weave visions of the Sídhe in his poetry, imagining them as luminous, perilous beings haunting the twilight. Contemporary fantasy, from J.R.R. Tolkien's elves to modern role-playing games, borrows heavily from the Celtic vision of hidden peoples dwelling in parallel realms. Even films and television, from Excalibur to the Mists of Avalon, echo the Celtic fascination with thresholds, sacred objects, and tragic heroes. Music, too, carries the resonance. Traditional Irish and Scottish songs often evoke the otherworld through haunting melodies, while modern Celtic-inspired bands continue the legacy with rhythms that feel both ancient and new. The drone of bagpipes, the cadence of the harp, the chant of folk ballads, all recall the Druidic sense that sound itself can bridge the worlds. Perhaps most striking is how Celtic myth continues to shape identity. In Ireland and Wales, myths of heroes and goddesses are not dusty relics, but cultural roots. They inform national symbols, from the harp of Ireland to the red dragon of Wales. Festivals revive old stories, while storytellers, poets, and musicians reinterpret them for modern audiences. What began as oral tradition still thrives orally, spoken, sung, and performed, not merely read. And beyond the Celtic lands, the fascination endures. Tourists seek sacred sites like Newgrange or Stonehenge, drawn by the allure of ancient alignments. Writers and gamers weave Celtic motifs into worlds of imagination. Halloween, May Day, and midsummer festivals carry their legacy across continents. Even those unaware of Celtic myth feel its pull. In the mystery of forests, the superstition around ravens, or the thrill of tales about hidden realms. Thus, what was once local has become universal. The myths that grew from Irish hillsides and Welsh valleys now belong to a global imagination. Their endurance shows that while empires may rise and fall, stories that speak of thresholds and otherworlds will always find new voices. Whenever myths are told, two questions arise. What do they mean, and why do they endure? For centuries, scholars have tried to untangle Celtic legend, separating story from history, imagination from evidence. The result is not to strip myths of magic, but to see how deeply they reflect the human experience. Anthropologists often note that Celtic stories mirror the structure of tribal society. In a culture without central empires, myths emphasize cycles, balance, and renewal rather than eternal order. Kingship myths, like those of Nuada or Luff, encode political lessons. A leader must be whole, must honor hospitality, must embody the land. These are not arbitrary tales, but mirrors of social expectations. A bad king brings famine, a good one ensures abundance. By clothing politics in myth, the Celts wove community life into the fabric of the cosmos. Archaeology adds another layer. Across Europe, ritual deposits in rivers, bogs, and lakes show that offerings to the unseen were real practices, not only imagined ones. The Gundestrup cauldron, with its images of horned gods and sacrificial rites, confirms themes later preserved in Irish manuscripts. Stone circles and passage tombs aligned with solstices reveal a cosmology attentive to celestial cycles, suggesting that myths of rebirth and thresholds were grounded in careful observation of the skies. In these alignments, myth and science were not opposed. Both expressed a quest for harmony with cosmic rhythms. Psychology, too, has its insights. Carl Jung saw myths as expressions of archetypes, universal patterns of the human psyche. In Celtic tradition, we find the hero, Cu Chulainn, the wise old man, the Druids, the triple goddess, the Morrígan, the trickster, the Dagda. These figures echo across cultures, but the Celtic versions are marked by fluidity, by their tendency to shift roles and identities. The Sídhe themselves are perhaps the clearest example, not purely gods, not merely spirits, but ambiguous beings who embody both beauty and peril. They mirror the complexity of life itself, where every gift may carry a risk, and every threshold both promise and danger. Historians remind us, however, that many Celtic stories reached us through Christian scribes. This means we must read them carefully, aware of layers of reinterpretation. When Balor's evil eye resembles biblical giants, or when the cauldron of rebirth parallels the Holy Grail, we see syncretism at work. Rather than diminishing the myths, this blending shows their resilience. They absorbed new contexts and kept speaking, even under foreign pens. What, then, explains their lasting power? Perhaps it is the sense of permeability that runs through every tale. The Celts imagined a world where nothing was sealed. Life flowed into death, gods into mortals, the otherworld into this one. Modern science may not describe hidden mounds or fairy feasts, but it too reveals a world of interconnection, ecosystems, cycles, unseen forces shaping our lives. The mythic language is different, but the intuition remains, that we are never fully separate from what surrounds us. In the end, Celtic myths endure because they do not present themselves as finished answers. They are questions carried in story form. What makes a ruler just? What lies beyond death? How do we honor the land we depend on? These questions remain urgent, and the myths keep offering images, not solutions, images that let us reflect, wonder, and reimagine. Thus, to weigh myth against scholarship is not to choose between them. It is to see how each illuminates the other. Archaeology uncovers the cauldron. Legend tells us it gives rebirth. Psychology sees an archetype. Myth gives it flesh and voice. History notes a battle. The tale shows us why it mattered. Together, they reveal not only what the Celts believed, but how human beings everywhere use story to navigate the mysteries of existence. As the last echoes of Celtic myth fade into the present, one question remains. Why do these stories matter now? In an age of satellites and digital maps, when every hill and river seems charted, what can tales of druids, spirits, and hidden realms offer us? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the details of the myths, but in the way they invite us to see the world. The Celts remind us that the boundaries we take for granted are not fixed. Life and death, human and divine, natural and supernatural, in their stories, all are porous. A mound is not just a mound, but a doorway. A tree is not only wood, but an axis linking earth and sky. A salmon is not simply food, but a vessel of wisdom. By telling such stories, they train their listeners to look at the world differently, to notice thresholds, to treat nature as alive, to accept that reality has more dimensions than meet the eye. In our own time, when climate change and ecological crises remind us how fragile our relationship with nature is, Celtic myths carry a quiet urgency. They teach that land and people are inseparable. A wounded king brings barren soil. A generous ruler restores abundance. Though cast in symbolic terms, the lesson is clear. We cannot thrive if the earth suffers. Hospitality, respect, and balance are not only cultural virtues, they are survival strategies. There is also comfort in the Celtic vision of cycles. In a world often obsessed with progress and finality, these myths offer a different rhythm, that endings are beginnings, that loss and renewal are bound together. Nuada's silver arm, Luffa's rise after Balor's fall, the endless feasts of the Sídhe, all speak of resilience, of life's ability to reshape itself. For those facing grief, uncertainty, or change, these stories suggest that what seems final may yet open into transformation. And then there is wonder, to hear of Bran's buried head guarding a kingdom, or of swans carrying human souls, or of goddesses who shift from maiden to crone and back again, is to be reminded that imagination itself is sacred. The Celts did not separate reason from myth, science from story. They lived in a world where both were needed, where a star's position and a raven's flight could be equally meaningful. For us, too, imagination is not escape, but a way of perceiving truths that facts alone cannot capture. Ultimately, the myths endure because they speak not only of the Celts, but of us. They ask how we honor wisdom, how we wield power, how we face death, how we belong to the land. They do not preach, but show us through images, through heroes and spirits, through rituals that tie people to place. And in showing us, they keep alive a way of seeing that might yet heal the distance we have created between ourselves and the natural world. So when we hear of the Tuatha Dé Danann retreating into the hills, or the Morrígan circling a battlefield, or Druids chanting beneath oaks, we are not only listening to the past, we are being invited to stand again at the threshold between history and myth, reason and imagination, the visible and the unseen, and perhaps to carry away from that threshold a renewed sense of reverence, not only for ancient stories, but for the living world that first gave them voice. In the end, the Celts did not leave us grand monuments of stone. They left us something more subtle, yet no less enduring, a way of perceiving. A reminder that beneath every landscape lies another, that every ending hides a beginning, that every ordinary thing shimmers with the possibility of the sacred. Their myths survive not because they are old, but because they are still needed, now as much as ever.